And looking at the major differences between the various groups of colonies, specifically really more of the New England area versus the southern colonies, we start to see some very big differences that are already beginning at this point. Southern society, for example, when you look at their social rankings, you've got the plantation owners who are on the very top. Those are the ones that are going to have the most money. And even though they do have a lot of money, it's not the same kind of what I call liquid capital, meaning they can't go out and buy things with it necessarily. All of their money is going to be tied up in their land and in their slaves that work that land. So in order to have that liquid capital, all of that comes from the crop that they sell when it's harvest time. So again, even though they do have a lot of money, it is all tied up into that land and those slaves. And even though the plantation owners are at the top, your small farmers make up the majority of the population at this point. They are going to be your just farmers who are making just enough for their own family's survival. Women are going to play a second-class role in the Southern society like they did in the majority of the colonies. Their role is mostly going to be relegated to the home and caring for things that are inside the home and really nowhere else. And even though they were citizens, they were not allowed any role in the government whatsoever. Indentured servants would be under women. Those were those people who had sold themselves into servanthood for a period of time in order to gain passage to the colonies. And then, of course, slaves were at the very lowest. And eventually, there would be no more indentured servants. It would all be slaves. And slaves at this point were considered a necessary evil. And again, it's important to note that at this point in the colonies, they do note that it is a necessary evil, meaning that they realize that owning slaves was not ideal, that it was not morally or ethically or even by their religious standards okay to do, but they believed that they had to own slaves in order for their economy to prosper. So again, we see it here mentioned as a necessary evil. So be sure that you note that, because this will change as time goes on about the way these citizens view their role in owning slaves. In the South, they are not going to really grow, food staples and any type of food crop. It's going to be cash crops. Their staple crops are going to be tobacco, rice, and indigo. Later on, I know we think of the South and we think cotton, but cotton really doesn't become a major cash crop until much, much later. So at this point, those main cash crops or staple crops are going to be tobacco, rice, and indigo. Those large plantations did dominate the economy, and in fact, a lot of times those large plantations even employed those smaller farmers to help them with those crops as well. So they are the ones who are definitely in charge. There were very few towns and cities because of this agricultural lifestyle. So whereas in the New England or northern colonies you have a lot more cities and towns, you really don't have that in the South, because the way an agricultural society is set up does not lend itself well to having a lot of towns. So this is what we have here. We have spread out farms, so there's really not as much interaction between the people as you would see in a New England area. The North is much different. It has what we call a diversified economy, meaning it's based in a lot of different areas instead of focused on only a few areas. So whereas the South was only in agriculture, you don't see that in the North. What you see here on the right is an apprentice. These are people who are doing some metalworking, and you would have people who go in and work under those skilled artisans and then learn that skill and then eventually go out on their own. One of the reasons they weren't solely based on agriculture was because of the very harsh weather conditions. The weather, or those winters in particular, were really very difficult and did not lend itself as well to being agricultural. They did, however, the farms they did have were food exports. So they are actually growing that stuff that people could eat, and they would send those to other places as well. And you've got lumber. That's going to be really readily available, and they use that to build their shipbuilding industry. That's going to be key for them to be able to do all the trading they need to do, as well as iron making, which is what you see here in that picture on the right. They were also big fishermen, so they're going to do a lot of fishing and whaling in those colonies as well. Now, one of the things to note is that we often don't think about the North having slaves, but at this point in the colonies, they did. Now, it wasn't as much, but I often think that people get confused and they think that the North was a, utopian society and it was, wonderful for minorities, but that's really not the case. It really comes down to the economics of it. Crops in the North did not require as much labor, so we say they're not as labor intensive as, say, tobacco, rice, or indigo. So because it required less labor, it required less man hours and less people. So the slaves they did have in the North had a skill, and they were often house workers or dock workers. So they're going to work on the docks with those other people who are doing those same type of skills. So a lot of times, what would happen is the slave in the North would have a skill, and the owner would basically loan them out or rent them out. So that slave would work for someone else during the day, but their wages would go back to the slave owner. Now, that does lend itself to having a few more freedoms, meaning they would be able to go to and from their workplace, for example. So while they do have more rights, they were not citizens and they were not free. And they might have had a few more liberties in the North compared to the South, but it's still not freedom. And what begins to happen in the North is that as immigrants come to the colonies and they flock to the North because of those cities, they are going to provide a lot of cheap labor. So in providing that cheap labor, there was just not a financial need for slaves. It was cheaper to simply hire immigrants. So a lot of these slaves end up being emancipated, and in fact, a lot of these colonies in the North just go ahead and abolish slavery. So they ban it in those northern colonies because it just wasn't necessary economically anymore. Colonial women had very few legal rights. They were really not even really considered citizens. Abigail Adams is one of the early women who are going to kind of push for those rights of colonial women. In fact, her husband, who was John Adams, who goes on to become the second president of the United States, Abigail Adams was very vocal about pushing for the rights of women. In a very famous letter she writes to John Adams, she says, "Remember the ladies, John," meaning that she knew the importance of women and wanted them to have more rights than they did. Many women did many jobs on the farms. If you're a farmer, your women are going to have to perform many of those jobs because you simply might not have had the labor to be able to perform them otherwise. So a lot of women had a lot of responsibility. Only single women were allowed to own any type of property or run a business. So if you were married and a woman, you would not be able to own property. You wouldn't be able to run a business. The only reason a single woman could do that would be to be able to take care of herself and possibly her children, since at this point it's very possible that her husband could have passed away. Religion at this point also made it very important for women to submit to their husbands. So it's that remember, especially in the New England colonies when religion was so important, is going to encourage the submission of women to men in those societies. Coverture is an important term that I want you to understand, and this is where basically a woman went from her father's care and protection straight to her husband's care and protection. So really she was thought of almost like an object to be cared for as opposed to an individual with rights and freedoms. So that was this whole idea. You can kind of get an idea of what people believed and felt for and believed about women at this point in time because of that whole idea that they needed to be protected and cared for in this society. Talking about women being able to even do things like owning land, the only way they would be able to even own land would be if her husband had died. And oftentimes what would happen is a man would then will that land or property to the woman so that his children could be cared for in the event that his wife were to remarry. So those types of things, you can kind of tell where the priorities were in colonial society. The Salem witch trials occurred in 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts. These Puritan community standards, remember these very strict religious standards, had been challenged. You had several young girls who began accusing various individuals in that community of being witches. when they were accused of being witches, the only option that an accused witch had was to either admit that they were a witch, which that would, indicate that they were in league with the devil, which would have been very difficult for a Puritan to do because their faith was so important to them. Or they could, if they admitted to being a witch, they would not be killed, but they would then have to name other witches. If they refused to admit that they were a witch, they were going to be executed. So this is going to be something that happens often as well. As many as 20 were executed. The trials later are suspended because it was clear that there was no clear evidence. This goes all the way up, and the very important people and the wives of very important people are being accused of being witches, and they realize that there was just no real evidence to support these claims, and that it was really hysteria that had taken over this area.